Afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Today's webinar is on decarbonizing your supply chain. It's a joint webinar between ACT Commodities, CDP, and Green Project Technologies. I'm Ben McMurray. I'm a strategist for sustainable agriculture here at ACT. We'll be joined by Daniella from CDP and Sam Stark from Green Project Technologies. The agenda for today, we're going to be covering 3 topics. Daniella will start with CDP supply chain program, go through the details of that, some information and data as well, and how the program works. I'll be diving through various emission sources in the supply chain, what those mean based on sector, and then some practical solutions to addressing those. And then Sam will be going through Green Project Technologies platform, which can help engage with suppliers and measure emissions, driving towards reducing them in the future. Now we'll turn it over to Daniella.
Thank you so much, Ben. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a pleasure being here today. My name is Daniella Pilz. I'm based in Berlin. I'm from CDP, as Ben just said, where I'm working as an account manager on our supply chain program, which I will be introducing to you today. So I will be speaking about environmental risks you're facing in your supply chains and how those can be tackled through supplier engagement and how companies are leveraging supply chain environmental data to drive action in their supply chains. So I will make the case for active supplier engagement and for using primary supplier data to drive action in supply chains. I assume most of you know CDP. For those who may not be so familiar with CDP, we are a global environmental impact nonprofit. We are running the global disclosure system that enables companies, cities, states, and regions to measure and manage their environmental impacts. We've built the most comprehensive collection of self-reported environmental data in the world, and we provide very granular and standardized data sets to facilitate year-on-year tracking. Next slide, please. So anyone who has worked with primary data knows that data collection is a lot of work. So why is it important? Why bother? Avoiding this type of work means high risk exposure. So there's basically no way around it. On this slide, you see some challenges and risks that are commonly present in supply chains. And the risks may vary from industry to another, but the 4 categories that you see here are mostly applicable to any economic activity. So we have physical risk, which includes climate change impact on natural resources, weather, ecosystems, biodiversity, those that are commonly outlined in environmental reports and published papers, right? You have regulatory and reputational risks. Policy actions around climate change continue to evolve. We just think about CSRD and also the EUDR in Europe, for example. And there's a risk that companies fail to adhere to upcoming regulations, which can then, for example, result in litigation and in reputational risks. There are also technology risks, such as limited data access, correctly understanding the timing of transition to new technologies, etc. Overall, we see a growing pressure from nature, regulators, investors, consumers, etc. And there's an urgent need to assess and to mitigate these supply chain risks and to drive action in your supply chain. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at greenhouse gas emissions, why do supply chain emissions matter so much? As you can see here on this slide, the overall Scope 3 emissions for most industries is where a large amount of emissions lie. So in some industries, such as the agricultural sector, Scope 3 Category 1, purchased goods and services, is where the largest part of the Scope 3 emissions lie. Then for other industries, the largest part may lie in Category 11, for example, the use of sold products, for example, in the automotive industry, but here as well with the electric vehicle transition, Category 1 purchased goods and services is becoming more and more important as well. According to CDP data, Scope 3 upstream emissions are on average over 11 times higher than the operational emissions of companies. The proportion obviously varies across industries. In the retail sector, for example, we have Scope 3 upstream emissions being on average 28 times higher than operational emissions. So in practice, this means a couple of things. focusing only on scope 1 and 2 emissions is basically like reading the first 10 pages of a book and then saying that you've read it. Most of your climate impact lies in your supply chains, and that means lies outside of your direct control. And to manage this impact, cooperation and supplier engagement are key, and that's essential both in terms of mapping and measuring your scope 3 emissions, but also in terms of tracking and driving emission reductions over time. And lastly, consumers, investors, and regulators don't care whether your environmental impact is in your direct business or in your supply chain. It is considered your impact, so your action is needed. Next slide, please. So the CDP supply chain program helps you, right, to actively engage your suppliers, to collect primary data, and ultimately drive action in your supply chain. But how does that work? We have our supply chain members, the customers, currently more than 350 of them, with a combined purchasing power of 6.4 trillion US dollars. And they identify strategic suppliers, they set expectations, and then they request information. Now, via the CDP questionnaires, in a standardized way, the requested suppliers are asked to report qualitative and quantitative information through CDP, right? Investors and supply chain members together are requesting thousands of companies. 2023, for example, we had more than 50,000 companies that were requested to disclose to CDP. The customers then use the data to evaluate environmental impacts, to manage climate, water, and forest risks, to track the progress of sustainability goals, and to make procurement decisions. And the suppliers, on the other hand, build capacity to improve performance by learning best practices, leveraging CDP resources, etc. Next slide, please. This graph here represents the number of entities that have disclosed environmental data to CDP over the years. The growth trend obviously is a consequence of the growing importance and the urgency of environmental issues, particularly in the corporate world. And the growth has been staggering in the past years. We reached over 23,000 companies with 66% of global market capitalization who disclosed their environmental data through CDP this year. That represented an increase of 24% since 2022. And in fact, disclosure numbers have at CDP have grown by over 300% since the Paris Agreement was signed. So we are increasingly seeing disclosure become a business norm now. Next slide, please. In the past years, major purchasers across various industries have joined the CDP supply chain program to engage their strategic suppliers and collect key data from them through our platform. And we've seen the request to disclose climate data cascade down the supply chain. So as you can see, based on this example on the slide here, not only retailers are requesting their suppliers, but also fast-moving consumer goods producers in Tier 2 are now engaging their suppliers in Tier 3 and so forth. Next slide, please. So the 3 CDP questionnaires cover different areas such as governance, risks and opportunities, targets, emissions, energy, etc. In addition, in each questionnaire, there's also a supply chain module. This one is dedicated to the allocation of emissions to your customers, to collaborative opportunities, and also product level data. And the supply chain module actually remains private, even if a company discloses publicly. So it's only shared between the supplier and the respective customer. So as a requesting company, you actually get all of the data that is disclosed by the supplier. So the entire questionnaire, the responses to the all of the questions, plus your respective supply chain module. Next slide, please. As we found over the years, not enough suppliers have actually reported product level data that is being asked for in the supply chain module, especially considering the relevance of product level data for companies with complex supply chains. We needed to find a solution for that, and CDP has then partnered with BCG to develop a tool called CO2 AI Product Ecosystem. So CO2 AI is now a standalone company, and Product Ecosystem is a tool that's offered in partnership with the CDP supply chain program. It's basically a collaborative data exchange platform for safe data exchange where customers can request product-level data from their suppliers. It is complementary to CDP data, and it will be integrated in the CDP questionnaire. Now, if suppliers do not have the data at hand, there's actually also a self-service product emission calculator embedded in this tool. Next slide, please. Now, we see the supply chain program really as a tool for moving your suppliers from a state of low awareness of environmental risk to active environmental management. So your suppliers will vary in terms of where they are on their disclosure journey. Some of the suppliers you are engaging may already be at the upper end of the spectrum, maybe having set science-based targets themselves. And some other suppliers will be responding for the first time, and they may need support and encouragement to start their journey. And the supply chain program helps all of your suppliers to move along this skyline as they improve their environmental management and reporting over time. It does require some time, and it also requires customers who are pushing them to improve. Next slide, please. So how does this skyline look in practice in an example? CDP in 2022 analyzed suppliers who began disclosing in 2019 and then consistently reported their climate impact over 3 years. And in terms of reporting operational emissions, within 3 disclosure years, the proportion of suppliers providing this kind of data increased by 9 percentage points. And the total number of those setting climate targets improved by on average 5 percentage points per year. Also interesting side note, in 2022, we had only 5% of disclosing companies that had validated Science-Based Targets Initiative validated near-term targets that are 1.5 degrees aligned. And we had an additional 3% committed to set and validate them. And we had less than 1% of disclosing companies that had SBTI validated net zero targets, plus an additional 4% committed to set and validate them. So we see how important it is that customers push their suppliers to improve performance. Next slide, please. So how could this guideline be used by a company to drive action in their supply chain? I brought with me a case study, Lego Group. Lego Group clusters their suppliers based on their level of maturity into 5 different levels along the skyline to benchmark their environmental performance. So for example, at level 4, a supplier would report demonstrable reductions in CO2 emissions and would also provide verifications of data. Next slide, please. Lego Group then, or more specifically actually the category managers who hold the relationship with the suppliers, they send out feedback letters after the disclosure period at CDP. They're asking the ones who did not respond why that was the case, and they're providing detailed feedback to the ones who did disclose, including, for example, where they would be positioned on this guideline that I just showed, and also recommendations to help them progress. Next slide, please. Spend a couple of words on the use of supplier data to decarbonize industry supply chains. So supplier data helps you to understand your overall supply chain performance compared to peers in the industry or to other companies in general. It is used to assess climate risks, to identify hotspots, and to track the performance of suppliers over time, right? Supply chain data enables you to communicate with your stakeholders, like, for example, customers or investors, on the environmental performance in your supply chain. It helps you to set meaningful targets and to start a conversation with your suppliers on the maturity of their climate management and how that is affecting your core business practices. Supplier data also helps you to understand whether any urgent actions are needed in your procurement processes, such as improving onboarding process for new suppliers or more capacity building offers, or even ending a business relationship. And then last but not least, supplier data can also provide a fertile ground for collaboration and innovation to reduce impact. Next slide, please. Now, if we're looking at primary supplier data from a carbon accounting perspective for Scope 3, let's go through some of the advantages over calculations that are based on, for example, industry averages. So On the one hand, primary data is a direct link to supplier engagement and performance. So it helps you to engage suppliers on their environmental performance in a direction that helps you meet your Scope 3 targets. And yeah, after all, the reason that you calculate your Scope 3 footprint is to be able to take action on it and to reduce it, right? Then using primary data enables you to get more granular information on your own suppliers' emission profiles, going beyond PCFs and painting a fuller picture on the maturity of their environmental management. Then as your suppliers' emissions change, you can set meaningful Scope 3 targets and you can incorporate annual reductions into your own footprint so you can track the progress year on year, right? Then while changing the products you purchase can be an important part of reducing your emissions, large-scale changes in your spend may not be feasible. So engaging suppliers to reduce emissions on a company level and accounting for these reductions enables you to reduce your Scope 3 impact without changing your spend. And lastly, through gathering supplier data from year to year, you can ensure that the data you base your Scope 3 calculations on is also as reasoned as possible. That said, there are also definitely some drawbacks. The first and biggest challenge is that primary data can be messy, and you must determine which data to trust, to include in your calculations. And then suppliers must build capacity, right, to report robust and granular data. And supplier engagement in that sense is a long-term project. So first, you need suppliers to build capacity to report accurate data to then be able to reduce emissions. Next slide, please. So to summarize, your impact lies in your supply chain. Understand where your suppliers are on their climate journey and collaborate to reduce the impact at scale. We have regulatory requirements and demands from consumers and investors and clients, and they are increasing. You can't manage what you don't measure. So again, here, primary supplier data enables you to track year-on-year progress against your Scope 3 targets and to identify emission hotspots in your supply chain. And then, supplier engagement is basically really the bedrock of a robust supply chain management. It helps build supplier awareness and capacity around disclosure and emission reduction. It helps with improving the granularity and quality of supplier data, enables data-driven procurement decision-making, and unlocks opportunities for innovation and decarbonization within your supplier relationships. Supplier engagement is really a long game. We like to say it's more of a marathon rather than a sprint, and it really requires time and resources and buy-in from key stakeholders, both on the side of the purchasing and the supplying companies. And the sooner you start gathering primary data, the sooner you start the conversation with your suppliers about their climate management, the better. Global warming is accelerating. Our climate action must follow suit in the narrow window that we have left to turn this trend around. So I'd say get started today. Last slide, please. So we really have a 6-year deadline, right, to halve global emissions and restore nature, and we need to do more collectively. CDP will also be changing quite extensively to accelerate action. We are currently building a modern, fit-for-purpose, scalable technology platform with an intuitive interface that will enhance user experience. So we're really working towards the level of flexibility, automation, and interoperability with other systems that our stakeholders have asked for. We will have a streamlined suite of data products that is responding to the feedback of our members. We will be introducing an API. So from 2024 on, there will be direct, automated, and secure data sharing. And we will also continue really to go beyond the foundations that are required by policy, right, to drive the market towards the most ambitious and robust environmental disclosure, also to cover all planetary boundaries, so including oceans, land use, biodiversity, and waste. And in 2024, we are moving to an integrated questionnaire. And last but not least, we will also build a better disclosure route for SMEs, enabling their supply chain and portfolio disclosure to be more robust. So we will, in 2024, introduce a dedicated questionnaire for SMEs. So exciting things to come for CDP and the CDP supply chain program. Thank you very much. And with that, I am handing back to Ben.
Thank you, Daniella. That was extremely thorough and practical. And just a reminder, we'll be sending out the recording afterwards for those of you who may have missed a point or two. It was very, very detailed and informative. So thank you so much. I'm Ben McMurray. I'm a strategist for sustainable agriculture here at ACT Commodities. For those of you who are not familiar with ACT, we are a market leader of market-based sustainability solutions. So we offer over 80 products to help companies in both their voluntary and compliance environmental requirements or targets, from renewable energy, biofuels, emissions products, agricultural products as well. And today I'll be discussing practical and effective strategies and how to engage your suppliers and reduce emissions. So let's start at the basics, the 3 scopes. There's a lot of different discussion around it, but what that is, it covers a company's entire value chain. And as we're speaking today, we're talking about just the supply chain. So what we're referring to, we did an independent analysis of CDP's public disclosures from last year, and we clustered up over 5,000 companies into different industries and took a look at where their emissions specifically came from. So what we've defined as supply chain emissions at ACT through CDP's data are scope 3 categories 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as you can see here, they're quite significant pieces of emissions. Next slide, please. These emissions categories fall into different sectors. They fall very differently. Not every category is the same, and one industry's emission sources could be totally different from another, depending on the nature of the business and complexity of the supply chain. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, we did a pretty extensive analysis of over 5,000 public responses to cluster up these industries into different sectors and really take a deep dive on where the emissions came from. So when you look at first, you can see the average company out of this group that we did for the analysis has about 1.7 million tons of emissions just within the supply chain, but that varies drastically when you look by sector. You can see, services, financial institutions have a much smaller supply chain emissions profile than, say, an energy and utility company. But when you dive even deeper into the individual categories, there's a much different story. So when you look just at purchased goods and services, which is scope 3 category 1, you really see that specific sectors such as distribution and retail, agriculture, food and beverage, and manufacturing have a huge percentage of their emissions come from the goods and materials they purchase. The second category is capital goods. This category is often overlooked because these are bigger, longer term purchases, not involved in day-to-day business like purchased goods and materials, but more longer term items, say factory tooling or construction equipment or something like that. And you can see it has quite an effect for that reason on the construction and real estate sector, as the capital equipment is more heavily involved in that sector. And then you get to fuel and energy related activities. When you look at the average company, it's quite a significant factor, but that's due because it's so heavily weighted in the energy sector and oil and gas, where things like the upstream emissions in natural gas production, for example, are a huge contributor of this emissions category. So that aspect of the supply chain is much different than, say, distribution and retail, where it's products you're purchasing. It's the production of the energy itself. And then finally, we're looking at transportation and distribution. So this is moving goods about. Obviously, it's heavily weighted in the transportation sector as well, through working with third-party transportation companies involved, whether it's subcontracting out. And then big in several categories, especially those involved with moving goods, and obviously distribution and retail, it's a significant portion as well. But that's a lot of fancy numbers. What does this all actually mean? So if you're in those sectors, the way to start is decarbonizing your supply chain. As Danielle mentioned, it begins with measurement. It's a continuous process. There's no magic solution. I wish I could have a slide here with all the answers on the next page. It would make my job a lot easier, but unfortunately I do not. So it's a continuous process, and we'll start with the short term. Engage and measure. As Danielle mentioned, you can't improve what you don't measure, or something along those lines. I don't think that's a direct quote, but so what does this mean? Some practical actions. You can procure products or materials that have life cycle analysis data. This is a start. So this is going towards gathering that primary data that Danielle mentioned, so you can get a better view of where your emissions are actually coming from. Some other ways to work with tier 1 suppliers is include emissions disclosure as a requirement or preference in your supplier requirements or documents, such as having them submit to CDP. This is a great way. Ask them to start measuring through a CDP supply chain disclosure. And you can request tier 1 suppliers to set science-based targets by a specified date, so you can signal that you want them to move in the future towards reducing. Now in the medium term, once you've begun measuring, we want to improve and reduce. So this is where you can include primary emission factor data as a requirement or preference. So rather than just using life cycle analysis, the specific measurements from companies. Include renewable energy procurement targets for tier 1 suppliers. This is one of the most common things we see, especially in the manufacturing sector. For example, you see companies set requirements of this year, tier 1 suppliers will have to have 30% renewable energy for the products they supply to us. This is a good way to begin with real steps and not overburden something on new suppliers, but also still start making action and get that progress going, because they need to get the ball rolling. To Daniella's point, we have to have global emissions in 6 years. So get the ball rolling and have something tangible and achievable, and as well have your tier 1 suppliers engage in those science-based targets and get them approved. In the long term, it's about innovating, right? We haven't figured this all out yet, getting rid of emissions. So it's important to strive towards really driving these emissions down. So investing further in upstream. Daniella showed that cascading effect. As your suppliers start to decarbonize, that'll push down to their suppliers and get this effect further up the supply chain. And this is a great way too of, say, if you're in food and beverage, going towards sourcing agricultural commodities where you may not have tier 1 suppliers. If you have a wide agricultural base around the world, getting that primary emissions data there. Requiring 100% renewable energy procurement. This is a great way to drive down scope 2 emissions of your suppliers. And request your tier 1 suppliers to achieve A-level scores on their CDP disclosures. This is a nice way to push them to stay with the trends, as CDP is constantly changing with the times on how they score their disclosures. So to get that A level means you have to be amongst the best. So this is a good way to set a target that can still be adapted as times move on and really get that leadership position. And next slide, please. How ACT can help you on this journey specifically. So if you're working in purchasing soft commodities where it's more difficult to work with tier 1 suppliers, as you have quite a wide base of various farms around the world. This affects, distribution, retail, agriculture, food and beverage, some other industries like healthcare and medicine involved with chemicals. There are ways to procure more sustainable agricultural commodities. We specifically help with soy, palm oil, and sugarcane. And to engage with suppliers more in the long term, we can help develop agricultural impact projects. And then for other more industrial industries with more larger organizations as tier 1 suppliers, engaging with those tier 1 suppliers and setting renewable energy targets is a way to quickly, I would say in the short term, have them start reducing their emissions through supplier renewable energy consumption. So working with us to set up a program and disclose with CDP and then reduce through renewable energy. This also applies to capital goods suppliers. And in the fuel and energy related activities, as I mentioned before, a large source of emissions there is fugitive emissions in natural gas production. So if you are a supplier of natural gas, purchaser of natural gas, or a large user of natural gas, we can help you procure certified natural gas that measures its fugitive emissions and takes actions to reduce it. And in the shipping and logistics, we can help with maritime shipping. We have some maritime biofuel solutions that can reduce emissions there as well. That is it for me. We will now turn over to Sam Stark, CEO of Green Project Technologies, where he can discuss their platform and how you can engage and measure your suppliers and understand that data better.
Amazing. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, super excited to chat today. So I think, one of the common themes that's kind of come up again and again is how do we actually engage our suppliers and provide them with a solution for them to track their emissions? Because I think one of the most challenging parts that places are trying to grapple with is that their suppliers, can be small to mid-sized businesses. They might not have sustainability teams like yourselves as a procurement manager. And how do we actually get the suppliers easy and accessible tools to be able to measure their emissions? And by quick background, before founding Green Project about 3 years ago, I was working at Goldman Sachs. So I was focused on our Scope 3 emissions. And a big question was we had a net zero supply chain commitment. And now it was not just about the commitment, but we had to figure out how are we going to actionalize this. And we had thousands of suppliers, even as a financial services company. And a big portion of those suppliers were small, mid-sized businesses who weren't necessarily reporting to CDP yet. And we wanted them to, but we needed to figure out tools to be able to help them do that. And a lot of the kind of softwares or programs on the market were really geared towards the large corporates decarbonizing, but not really geared towards their actual suppliers or their finance emissions, figuring out ways to decarbonize. And so Green Project was really founded to be kind of a more accessible way for suppliers themselves to actually decarbonize their emissions to obviously reduce your Scope 3. So you go to the next slide, or next, yeah. So yeah, we've worked with so far over 500 suppliers. We're doing pilots with a number of big procurement managers, and really our objective is to bring kind of accessible Scope 1 through 3 and upstream Scope 3 reporting for suppliers and vendors to larger corporates. And that is where we've seen a huge gap. A lot of large corporates have done a spend-based or maybe even starting to do some LCAs with some of their big products for their Scope 3 emissions, but now it is how can we actually actionalize our suppliers and empower our suppliers for them to reduce their emissions. So how does a company get started with this? That's a kind of a big question. We've talked to a lot of procurement managers and they say, yes, we know Scope 3 is a big source of emissions. We know we want them reporting to CDP and then eventually setting science-based targets, but how do we actually take the steps in engaging them to take that pathway? And so there's really kind of 3 steps in doing so. So the first, and we have kind of a program of doing this, but the first is education, and we call it mobilization. And this is creating a space to actually educate suppliers on why this is important, how they measure emissions, really kind of what the significance of this and why, as whatever company you are, you need your suppliers to be making these commitments in order for you to achieve your own commitments. And so education is an important component, and Green Project will host webinars and kind of walk companies through and suppliers through. And it also makes suppliers feel like they're not alone, because suppliers obviously there's thousands of them, and they all are getting these requests daily, for them to report on emissions. And I think a lot of them feel very isolated because they don't have sustainability teams. So hosting kind of webinars and education sessions is kind of the first way to kind of help suppliers start that journey. The second is measurement, and obviously that's kind of the really kind of significant undertaking that you need the suppliers to actually figure out a way to measure their emissions. And what I will say for the measurement side is one size doesn't always fit all. So Green Project specifically, we focus on really making it more accessible for kind of mid-market suppliers, smaller suppliers to track and report their emissions. But you might need another tool for even really large and huge suppliers. So there isn't one size fits all for tracking and reporting emissions with suppliers. but it's creating a kind of a multiple tool in your tool belt to give suppliers ways for them to actually measure their emissions. And software does a really good job at this because it can help automate and streamline this, because most of your suppliers, you know, they've never done this before and they don't have a sustainability program. So similar to SOC 2, when you had cybersecurity requirements put down into your supply chain, it's a kind of similar process of taking it in steps for emissions data here. The final way after measurement, and we'll go into more depth of each of these, but is the management. So measuring is good, and that's obviously the first step, but it's only so good, right? You need them to actually take steps to reducing emissions. Otherwise, just having the data, it gives you insights, but you need actual changes. And so a lot of places are requiring SBTI commitments from their suppliers. Some places aren't going as aggressive, but you eventually need suppliers to actually be taking action. And that's a really important part. So if we go to the next slide. This is kind of something, and this has taken a lot of procurement managers are starting to implement something along these lines. And, you know, it's really trying to move your suppliers from 1 to 5. And 1 being a supplier who's never reported emissions, doesn't know what to do, and that's kind of where you're in the education phase. 2 is maybe they're starting to track emissions, they know that this is important, but they're not reporting it to anybody like CDP. Like they're starting to report it maybe internally, but it's not actually an external report. They're not kind of going through those extra steps that you need. 3 is reporting, and it's highlighted in yellow because it's kind of that middle step where you do need to, you know, it's good, they're reporting, they're understanding their emissions, and that's kind of like right when they're about to take action. And then 4 and 5 is actually having them set science-based targets, which obviously CDP aligns with SBTI well for the disclosure portion of it. So it's kind of a full picture with CDP and SBT target setting. And what I will say is, you know, this is where we've really taken procurement managers kind of on this journey. And it's not that you need every single supplier doing this all at once, but if you take, you know, sections of your suppliers, if you start doing it in phases, you know, your biggest ones might already be doing this, and they might already be reporting to CDP and setting science-based targets. Go to the next tranche down to the kind of mid-tier suppliers. And then from there, go to the smaller suppliers. It's really, you know, doing this in kind of tranches and angles. As I think Daniella said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But it can be broken down and simplified when you kind of take it in kind of these different kind of tranches. And because you're not the only procurement manager demanding this of their suppliers, you're going to have kind of strength in numbers. Pretty much all of the major procurement managers we're starting to talk to are starting to want these similar commitments. And so you're going to be one of, you know, 40 or 50 procurement managers to the suppliers telling them this. And as they get more pressure, they're going to realize this is a business decision. Whether or not they feel that they have the capacity, they will find it's truly a business decision for them to do this. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, sorry, one more. Perfect. Yeah, so I know I mentioned this, you know, where we come in, again, is really trying to make this process easy. So Green Project will host kind of 3 different steps. The first one is an education webinar with suppliers. We typically will start with the pilot phase to not be overwhelming, and kind of do a select cohort of suppliers. Some places have kind of a group of suppliers they really trust. We'll do an education webinar with them. And if we go to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, this is kind of being able to do an hour-long, we'll post a few different times, and walking them through, because I think a lot of suppliers, when they realize what it takes, are actually, it's more scary before starting. And once they understand, okay, you know, it's really finding the sources of your emissions data and finding a way to streamline that into a way to kind of provide it to a platform that can do the calculations, it's a lot less overwhelming for them. And so just having them understand this and having them understand the regulatory environment, that Scope 3 emissions now with CSRD is included, with California, that it's becoming like a mandatory. And it used to be kind of more of an opt-in, and now it's going to become more of an opt-out. And I think that understanding for a supplier really helps them, you know, put in context that they kind of need to start working now towards measuring and then eventually actualizing, but at least right now just measuring being kind of the first step. And then the next part is the measuring, obviously. And this part is, it is daunting, and you're not going to get every supplier signed up. There are places, and we've seen this, putting in contracts when they sign up a new supplier or renew a supplier, that they have to, as a requirement, track and report their emissions. But even if you do that, and we've seen places threaten to drop suppliers, and that is kind of some of the tools you can use, but you won't still get 100%, right? There is still going to be suppliers who are going to hold out, and you're not going to get everyone, but it's taking the steps, because over time, more pressure is going to mount, more suppliers are going to feel the pressure from other procurement managers, and so you'll get more adoption. But if you try to do everything all at once and say, oh, don't worry, in 2026, we're going to get 100% of our suppliers to sign up, it'll be too overwhelming, and you'll be kind of realize that's kind of, you can't kind of wait until then. So breaking it up and saying, 2024 will be our first year. We're going to start engaging some of our suppliers who aren't currently reporting. Maybe we try to get 20% higher adoption, and then 2025 we go for 40%, and kind of have a pathway of adoption. That's a way more manageable thing. And again, not even to just plug Green Project, we're not the only tool out there. There's lots of different tools focused on tracking emissions. Where we really focus is our platform is much more accessible for kind of those mid-market and smaller businesses. You really need to get their disclosure of emissions data, but you're like, this is going to be a really big undertaking because they don't have a sustainability program. And being able to integrate with 12,000 utilities or accounting and travel softwares makes that data collection a lot less overwhelming for them, because they don't have to spend as much time doing it. Plus, it's a lot more affordable than some of the other platforms. But there are other platforms out there who can help with some of your really big suppliers, maybe. And so it's finding kind of that multi-pronged strategy to get your supply chain engaged. Next slide. And then the final thing is really net zero. And like, in the end, not every company is setting science-based targets, but we do see a lot of companies who've set science-based targets. I think there was a recent article by the Net Zero Tracker was looking, and I think it's like 4% of companies who have set science-based targets are even kind of close to being on track. And so, in order for you to kind of be on track, you need to get your suppliers themselves to be setting their own science-based targets. And maybe some companies, if you're not yourselves setting SBT, you could have them set some sort of other smaller targets to start off. But I really think the gold standard is having your suppliers set science-based targets. And that is not a small undertaking, and you're not going to get 100% adoption. But we have seen increasingly that starting to occur with even the smaller and medium-sized suppliers setting science-based targets. There's a slightly different target also for SME businesses than the large corporates. And so really trying to push that as the gold standard and saying you can be a preferred supplier if you have set a science-based target and gotten it validated. That's really the final step. And this is where obviously ACC can come into play as well, because they have a lot of different strategies that aren't just pure play offsets, but there are also other kind of renewable energy and things in carbon insetting that can actually be validated by FCT. And that's kind of obviously a huge component of it, because FCTs limit the amount of offsets that you can offset for your residual emissions. So the final step really is that kind of gold standard of having them set science-based targets. And we've done this with a number of procurement managers now, where we can see, you slowly whittle away when you get from the measuring to the science-based target. You're not going to get all the same amount of suppliers, but it's about getting as many as you can and trying to improve that number over time. Next slide. I think pretty much on there. Yeah. So that's, I think, kind of recaps, most of what I wanted to go over is it is possible, but you have to get started somewhere. And starting off with cohorts, having multiple tools in your tool belt, again, is really where you want to focus and make it more accessible for your suppliers to be able to do this, so that your suppliers have a multi-pronged strategy, and they don't feel like they're isolated or alone doing it. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Sam. Now on to the question and answer section. As mentioned before at the beginning, please type them in the chat. And for those of you who are unsure what this is, you ask questions and we try to answer them. So that's what we'll do for the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar. So please start firing the questions out now.
So I see a question in my chat function. I'm going to read it so that everyone knows what the question is. In the CDP supply chain module, do CDP currently or do they plan to have any quality checks on data provided in the survey? We have seen lots of different allocation methods used suppliers with no evidence or references included, which makes it difficult to know how reliable the data is. So maybe two parts to the question. So yeah, we have in the CDP questionnaire under C6.10 a question for the verification of emissions, for example, right? So it's correct in the sense that we don't sort of audit the data that is provided in the questionnaires, but suppliers can sort of give details of the verifications of their emissions. They upload even a PDF indicating sort of the verification. And so the skyline that I showed you, right, the supply chain members try to move their suppliers up on that skyline. So they will also push them to get their emissions data verified, right? That is sort of improving their performance is part of that, to actually have emissions data verified. And the second part of the question is we have a data output that is called the Scope 3 report. So that's where we provide the allocated emissions data, for example, and we also give an indication of whether we consider that allocated emissions data robust enough, or whether we suggest to actually use emission intensities and revenues to get to self-allocate spend-based. And then we also provide manually calculated by CDP emission intensities, and we sort of suggest which ones to use. And if none of these are robust enough, according to our understanding, we also provide sector averages that are based on the most robust data in our database, so that supply chain members can work with that if the data isn't robust enough. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Sam, would your product and training be available in, I think maybe this is the one, kind of showing up weird, in multiple languages than just English? So yes, we're adding language packs to the platform. So you will be able to, we're trying to expand to as many languages as we can. We're going to start off with about 10 or 12 languages and then kind of continue to expand out from there. And the trainings as well will be the same. We've, have been hiring people in Europe and APAC. Because we know a lot of supply chains can be, in APAC. So definitely that's kind of an important component of it. We've started off in English, but we are expanding to multiple different languages for both the training and the product. And we have emission factors in 150 different countries. So, most countries around the world, we can convert kind of the emission generating activities to greenhouse gas emissions in alignment with the greenhouse gas protocol. And all of our reports are auditable as well.
Thank you, Sam. Any other questions?
I think I see one more, just that how do you know that the data is validated and ready to be audited on your platform? So we have lots of different, like we call them, different checks and error checks. So during the onboarding process, we ask the companies different questions, like do you have a fleet? Do you have refrigeration, different questions like that. And based on those answers, if we don't collect data or data is missing from a facility or from a certain emission generating activity, the system will flag that as potentially erroneous. And so we can flag different things. Obviously, you'll never know. You still need limited assurance to be able to tell if it's audit ready. But we can do different flags to make sure if there's anything missing. And we provide a full audit trail. So every bill that comes into the platform, let's say it's a utility bill or a spend piece of data, gets assigned an ID. And so there's a full transparency trail of all of the calculations, of all the bills, et cetera, in the platform.
All righty. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Daniella. Going once, going twice on questions. All right, I think that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. Really very insightful webinar, I hope. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to each of us individually. CDP, find out more about their supply chain by contacting supplychain@cdp.net. ACT commodities, any questions about agricultural commodities, reach out to my email personally. And for other stuff around renewable energy procurement for your suppliers, reach out to supply chain at ACT Commodities, and we will get in touch with you there. And for a green project, you can send to their info box, and Sam will come to your house personally and answer all your questions. No, I'm just kidding. All right, thank you so much, guys. We'll send out these slides and this recording here in the next couple days. Thank you for your time and attention. Really appreciate it.